Hey everyone, welcome back to Bizinstitution Macroeconomics Unit 3 video. So let's look at the table of contents that we're going to talk about today. So the first one is aggregate demand, which is basically the total demand for all the goods and services produced domestically. Then we move on to the short-run aggregate supply curve, which shows the total supply for goods and services produced domestically. Then we go to the long-run aggregate supply curve, which shows the supply of a nation's goods and services in the long run. Then we have equilibrium and self-adjustment, which talks about the self-correcting nature of the economy. And last but not least, surely we have the fiscal policy. So, aggregate demand. What is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services produced domestically. This is how the aggregate demand curve looks. So as you can see, we have price level over here, then we have output income. Usually it would say real GDP because that's a good measure of the countries of how of its goods and services produced. Like any demand curve, it'll always be shifted. It'll always have a negative slope and will look like this. Because the lower the price level, the more output or more GDP there will be. So what are the factors that shift aggregate demand? And remember, when we talk about shifting, we mean like the graph moving right or left. Right is an increase, left is a decrease. So the factors that actually affect aggregate demand is the same factors that affect the expenditure report to the GDP. We see consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So how so? Well, if consumers spend more, that means the aggregate demand will move towards the right as the GDP will increase. Same with investment spending and government spending. More spending equals to higher GDP, which means the aggregate demand curve shifts right. And vice versa, if the consumer spending, investment spending, government spending decrease, that means the curve will shift left, lower GDP. Well, what about net exports? So basically, if a country exports more, they're producing more money. More money equals aggregate demand going right. More imports equals aggregate demand going left. That's basically a gist of aggregate demand. Now let's look at the second part, which is a short-run aggregate supply curve, which basically shows the total supply for goods and services produced domestically. And notice here it says short run. This is important for the next topic that I explain. So what is the short-run aggregate supply curve? It's the total supply for goods and services produced domestically, like previously said. It has price level here, real GDP, same labels, and as you can see, it's an upward sloping curve like any supply curve would be. Now, what are the factors that shift the SRAS curve or shifting it left and right? Well, productivity. If you're more productive, if your workers are more productive, then obviously, your curve will, you're gonna produce more. What about input prices? Well, the prices, the commodities that you pay, like such as oil or things that you use to make other goods. If the prices for that goes up, that means you're gonna have to price your goods higher, shifting the supply aggregate curve to the left. Now, talking about wages, we have to take into account that in the short run, wages are sticky. So what does sticky wages mean? So basically, if you think about it in a way, um, uh, whenever you go to a new job, you're under a contract for a certain period. For a certain period, for that contract, the a company has promised you to give in this much money. So even though inflation occurs, or for example, now that if the price level goes down, they're paying you more expensive money. Well, but they can't, they've set a nominal value. They can't, officially take that value away. They can't decrease or lower it in the short run based on the aggregate supply. So if the wages, if price level goes down and the wages remain the same, that'll affect the supply and aggregate short run aggregate supply curve. It'll go left and right depending on how high or how low the wages are, because again of inflation. Then there's supply shock. So what is a supply shock? Well, supply shock can be positive or negative. It's basically anything that affects commodities, or basically, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war, oil is getting, hard to obtain, and hence we've seen that the prices of oil have gone up. That's exactly a negative supply shock. It's then causes supply to decrease, which hence has caused the price to, increase, the price level to increase, as we can see over here. So yeah, that's basically the short run aggregate supply curve. Now let's focus on the long run aggregate supply curve. How does the supply curve of a nation look in the long run? Well, it's just a vertical line. That's all it is. Well, why? Well, because in the long run, everything that wasn't adjustable due to inflation is now. Because now contracts have ended. You can adjust wages. It has been a few years since whatever supply shocks occurred. So you can now adjust everything, all the prices according to it. So the long run aggregate supply curve is how much you will be producing at a full employment type of economy. The words associated with the long run curve is the full employment, full productivity, and the stable economy. As you can see, the economy is growing, it's blossoming good. It's kind of where the GDP, the price and GDP is where they're most stable. It's basically a place where the economy is very healthy. Equilibrium and self-adjustment. So what is the short run equilibrium? Well, the short run equilibrium is simply the place where the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply curve intersect. That's known as the short run equilibrium. Long run equilibrium. It's the point and when the short run aggregate supply curve, long run aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve all intersect. As you can see, that will be over here. This is the place where the economy is the most stable. It's full employment. Basically, everything is going smoothly in the economy. Basically, the employment is at its natural rate, which is the lowest that it could be. So it's probably the best economy that it could be. Now, what's the negative output gap? It's when the short run equilibrium, as you can see over here, is left further from the long run aggregate supply curve. So now, what does this mean? Well, basically, we're not producing any more full output. The prices are a bit low. We're not making as much money. So this could be associated with recession. People are unemployed, and the goods are relatively cheaper, but still, not a lot of people have jobs. Because a good thing to notice is that the more left you go on this on the x-axis over here, you can say is the more the unemployment is, and the higher you go here, the more price of the goods are. And that's simple if the y-axis going up. Now, what's a positive output gap? Well, it's when the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve, so basically the short run equilibrium, is rightward from the long run aggregate supply curve. Why is this bad? Well, as we talked about in the previous unit, inflation. Inflation is good, is not good. It has its drawbacks, and the economy, is too smooth at this point. The prices are way too high. Although unemployment is still not 100% fine, but the economy also has a self-correcting nature. The economy has a nature of always coming to backwards to long-run equilibrium. No matter what, no matter how much time it takes, it will eventually come back if the economy is left stable and nothing has changed. It will eventually come back to long-run equilibrium, because again, everything in the long run, nothing is sticky, so everything has to adjust back to the way it was. Fiscal policy. So what do we mean when I say fiscal policy? Well, basically, policymakers can make policies to shift the aggregate demand. We may ask, why can't they shift the aggregate supply? Well, they could, but two things. It's not directly in control. Supply is kind of hard because there's a lot of companies working. There's a lot of other things that have to influence. The government can directly influence aggregate demand, as I'll show later. And another thing is aggregate supply shifting. It can cause a lot of problems too, because if it shifts leftwards, as I'll show you in later with the graph, the aggregates it'll cause stagflation, which means your economy is not growing at all, but prices are still inflating. This is probably the worst state an economy could be in if it is stagflating. Hence, the policymakers just shift the aggregate demand. How do they do it? Well, they have two ways. The first one is the expansionary fiscal policy. It's basically when your economy is in recession and the fiscal policymakers will make so that it goes rightwards. So how they do this? Well, they're gonna help people spend more. How they do this? One way is you gotta increase your aggregate demand. How would you do that? So you gotta give the factors where consumer spending, investor spending, government spending. So the main things that they can impact here is consumer spending and government spending. Well, how would they impact consumer spending? Cutting the taxes. Cutting the taxes means now people can spend more. If I'm making more, my marginal propensity to save, which means the amount I save for every additional dollar I make goes down, because now I feel, oh, I do make a bit more money, so I can spend a bit more because the tax rate is low. Well, now for government spending, they'll actually increase government spending. They'll create more transfer payments. They'll just spend more in general just to make sure that the economy is running, and hence they'll create this multiplier effect where the aggregate demand shifts rightwards and meets with the goes back in long run equilibrium. Now, what is contractionary fiscal policy? Well, it is used to deal with, when the prices are way too inflated, they're way too high. So it's basically, oh, sorry for the typo there. It's not a policy that helps people spend. It's a policy that helps people spend less. So tax rates would actually be increased here. So now that my taxes are increased, that means I'm earning less. My marginal propensity to save will go up, and my marginal propensity to consume will go down because now I'm making less. I want to spend less to make sure I have enough for the basics, or enough to basically ensure my survival in the long run. And then they're going to decrease government spending because again they don't want too much money in the system. So hence this will cause the aggregate demand to go downwards and shift back to equilibrium. But one point to be noted is that although these fiscal policies sound nice, the economy does also self-adjust. So sometimes these fiscal policies can have a negative effect in which they're possibly adjusting economy, gets screwed up. So fiscal policy have to make sure that how much they cut the tax rates by, and how much they spend. They also have to make sure that they calculate it, if how much are they going to be affecting the economy, and if they're affecting it enough or if they're affecting it too less, because they don't want to go into recession, and if they're solving from recession, they don't want to go back to a state of inflation. There's also a few ways to calculate that, I'll show you in future videos. And again, thank you for watching the Unit 3 video. I hope you learned a lot.